The Anglo-Zanzibar War was so short that the ladies who had sought refuge on the Royal Navy flotilla were able to return to their homes in time for lunch. Short parties were landed and to help rescue people they could from the debris, but 500 of Khalid's soldiers died in the rubble that had been the Sultan's palace. A party was sent from HMS Philomel to take charge of the Sultan's yacht, the Glasgow. She had been hauled along the waterline and began to settle at the stern. The men tried to stop up the holes and save her, but she sank at 10:45, leaving only her masts and funnel visible above the surface. She lay there undisturbed until 1910, when the last of her masts collapsed. This set off a string of correspondence between the harbour-master and the government, as they decided what they were going to do with the wreck. It was finally broken up in 1912 using explosives. 5 wounded Zanzibari sailors from the Glasgow were taken to HMS Philomel for treatment. 14 other sailors from the Glasgow were taken to HMS St George, along with the Royal Navy's only casualty, Petty Officer James from HMS Thrush. Petty Officer Second Class George James was born in 1860 in Brentford in Middlesex. He joined the Royal Navy as a 16-year-old. He survived, but his wounds he received during the Zanzibar War meant he was discharged as an invalid after they returned to Britain. The British could have abolished the Zanzibar Sultanate entirely and made the islands a crown colony. There was nobody there that could stop them. But while Khalid sat under the protection of sailors from a German warship anchored in the harbour, Zanzibar was made a British protectorate as they did not want the expense of running the administration. At 1:25, the Sultan's flag was rehoisted above the smouldering ruins of the palace, proclaiming a new Sultan for the new protectorate, Hamid bin Mohammed. The ships of the flotilla gave him a 21-gun salute. Looking around the smouldering ruins of his palace, the new Sultan must have felt that the protection that the British were offering was much the same as the protection the mafia might offer a small business, to prevent the ever-present danger of their shop burning down, with them tied up inside it. The 45-year-old Hamid bin Mohammed was described as an elderly gentleman, respected for his prudent and peaceful conduct. He did not have the independence enjoyed by his predecessors, as the British tightened their control over the military, finance and executive affairs of the Sultanate, but he was still sovereign. As a protectorate, Zanzibar would remain ruled by the Sultan and under Islamic law. The British would deal with external affairs, while the Sultan dealt with internal matters, but much like Don Corleone, the British might occasionally ask for a favour. Sultan Hamid must have already known what this favour would be. The British were only interested in one thing. This was trade. Mostly this meant opening up the country to more of it, but there was one exception. This was one type of trade that they spent most of the last century trying to eliminate. This was the trade in people. After getting rid of their own slave trade in 1806, Britain had embarked on a crusade to get rid of slavery worldwide. The smouldering ruins of Zanzibar were only a small fraction of what it had already done to achieve this. For the first 60 years, the West Africa Squadron had worked to destroy the Atlantic slave trade. It had brought them into opposition with every other Atlantic power, with them having to go to war more than once. Then, after succeeding in the West, Britain had set their sights on East Africa. When Khalid's father, Sultan Bargash, ascended the throne in 1870, enslaved Africans were so cheap on Zanzibar that it was not uncommon to find them abandoned on the streets to die. All that he said about this was that slavery was a time-honoured institution sanctioned by the Islamic religion and ancient custom. The British had forced a series of treaties upon Zanzibar, which the Sultan Hamid's predecessors had done their best to ignore. Continuing the slave trade had become an emblem of independence. They all knew that the abolition of slavery meant welcoming the collapse of the Sultanate. The plantations that made the local aristocracy wealthy depended on enslaved labour. When they were introduced, the enslaved population of Zanzibar had risen from about 15,000 in 1819 to 100,000 by the 1830s. The Sultan at the time had owned 45 clove plantations, with up to 6,000 or 7,000 enslaved people toiling on each. By the time of Khalid's coup, there had been 63,000 enslaved Africans on Pemba alone. But now the British would not accept any further resistance. As many had feared, getting rid of slavery gutted the Sultanate's economic base, and reduced the Arab aristocracy to little more than peasants. They were the backbone of the economy. Without them, the plantations and many other enterprises simply collapsed. Many plantations were abandoned, and Zanzibar never recovered from the shock of abolition. Neither did the Sultanate, which had financed itself on the export duties from the now abandoned plantations and import duties on the people working on them. But that was still in the future. At 2:25, the remaining British subjects were being landed from HMS St George. The shore parties returned to their ships over the rest of the day. First was HMS Philomel's gun crew, then some Royal Marines from HMS St George. After that, the sailors who had been landed as a fire brigade returned, having done what they could to keep the town safe. There wasn't much that they could do for the palace and harem, which had been the main targets of the bombardment. They were too unsafe to be repaired and would eventually be demolished. Another building, used by the Sultan as an official reception hall, was also damaged, but it would be repaired. It was called the House of Wonders, and it is still there to this day. It got its name because it was the first building in East Africa, and one of the first in the world, to be lit by electricity. Even before Khalid attempted his coup, the townspeople understood where the real power lay. But that's not to say the destruction was entirely confined to the Sultan's palace and harem. At 8 o'clock, a steam cutter from HMS Thrush was manned, armed, and sent over to HMS St George. It met up with other boats. As the sun dipped towards the horizon, they began to patrol the harbour. Sailors and marines also landed to patrol the streets. They wanted to discourage people from taking advantage of the power vacuum but to go looting. But despite the patrols at both sea and on land, many of the homes of the Indians who acted as financiers to Zanzibar's merchants were looted, with 20 people killed. Being Hindu, and the Indians were not bound by the Sharia, and so they could lend money with interest. It was through their loans that the Arabs of Zanzibar had acquired firearms for the slave trading caravans which raided deep into the African mainland. Having access to Indian finance had allowed their profits to increase, but nobody likes their banker. Khalid, the pretender, was sheltering in the German consulate until he could be smuggled onto a German warship, the Sayadler. This took him to the German colony of Dar es Salaam. He left at high tide so he could be taken from the consular garden directly onto a boat without stepping onto Zanzibari territory. He would never set foot on the island again. Sultan Hamid bin Mohammed awarded Rear Admiral Rawson the Order of the Brilliant Star of Zanzibar. The British consul was awarded the Grand Cross of the Brilliant Star. Within a year of his ascension, Sultan Hamid bin Mohammed finally abolished the legal status of slavery within Zanzibar. He received surprisingly little resistance from the slave-owning planters, who could also see the smouldering ruins in the middle of their capital. By 1899, the smuggling of slaves into Zanzibar had reduced to the point that the British felt safe to withdraw their warships who were needed in the Second Boer War. The trade in people continued from mainland Africa into the Caliphate, and the British would not be able to force its complete abolition until 1907. They would still be catching dhows carrying small numbers of enslaved people right up until the end of the century, and beyond. Khalid bin Bargash would be a guest of the German Empire until the First World War broke out. He was captured on February the 19th, 1917, along with his two sons, just south of Dar es Salaam. On the 14th of July 1917, the War Office in London received a telegram that he and his party had left East Africa. He was initially interned in the Seychelles, and then in St Helena, before being allowed to return to the Seychelles. He was finally allowed to settle in Mombasa. He died there on the 19th of March 1927 at the age of 53, having spent 32 of those 53 years in exile. Next time, I'm going to start talking about the whole of the Islamic slave trade going on the East African coast. If you'd like to hear about that, then please press like and subscribe. If not, then thank you for listening this long.